I have been driving a cab in New York for 23 years, and I have hauled just about everything in my back seat. Executives bawling their eyes out after getting fired, couples fighting on their way to a divorce, celebrities pretending to be normal folks, criminals running from the cops, and even a guy who swore he saw a UFO on the Brooklyn Bridge. But that freezing December night, when Sylvester Stallone hopped into my car at JFK Airport, carrying a box of Cuban cigars in one hand and a coffee-stained yellowed script in the other, I had no idea I was about to hear the most brutal, honest, and inspiring story about struggle, sacrifice, and redemption that has ever crossed my path. He had the deep, dark circles of someone who had traveled the entire world, but he was smiling like a man who had just won a war that lasted decades and could finally rest. The destination was the Waldorf Astoria on Park Avenue, a ride that normally takes 45 minutes with the heavy Manhattan traffic, but that journey would feel infinitely longer and deeper than any GPS could ever calculate. During that ride, which seemed to suspend time itself, Sylvester Stallone, the same man the whole world knows as Rocky Balboa and John Rambo, told me every sordid and glorious detail of how he went from living in a rat-infested apartment in Hell's Kitchen and selling his dog Butkus for a miserable $50 just to pay back rent, to becoming the embodiment of the American dream by writing, in just 3 feverish days, the script that would change Hollywood forever and prove that failures can become legends. And every word, every pause, every tear he held back proved a truth that most people never learn. Sometimes the distance between the gutter and the top of the world is not measured in money, luck, or connections, but rather in how many times you can get back up after being brutally knocked out by life and still refuse to sell your soul when they offer the highest price. At the first stoplight after leaving the airport, Sylvester Stallone broke the silence the way people with a story to tell always do. Straight up, no beating around the bush. "Cabby, do you believe in destiny?" he asked me, his raspy voice cutting through the noise of the Fifth Avenue traffic. I looked in the rearview mirror and replied that I believed in choices. His hands tightened around that yellowed script in his lap, and he let out a tired smile. "Then let me tell you about the choices that almost killed me." Stallone started describing 1975, when he was living in Hell's Kitchen in a studio apartment that looked more like a tomb. The rent was 4 months behind, the radiator had been broken for months, and the walls were covered in black mold that he did not even try to clean anymore. "I would wake up in the morning and watch my own breath turn to smoke inside the house," he said, his gaze lost out the taxi window as if he were seeing that miserable place all over again. The New York cold that winter showed no mercy, and he slept fully dressed, with 2 shirts and an old coat on top. "The loneliness of that era was brutal," he continued. Stallone went to 300 acting auditions a year and heard 300 no's. Casting directors would look at him and tell him to his face that his face was crooked, that he slurred his words too much because of the partial facial paralysis he had since birth. One guy told me, "Stallone, you don't have the face of a hero. You look like a third-rate hoodlum. Forget this leading man idea." The words came out of his mouth slowly, as if they still burned after all these years. I noticed he gripped the script tighter as he retold that part. But in the middle of all that misery, Stallone had a companion, Butkus, a huge bull mastiff he had rescued from the street. "That dog slept on top of me on the coldest nights, shared the crumbs of stale bread I managed to buy with my last pennies," he said, and for the first time his voice cracked. Butkus did not care if Stallone was poor, if the apartment was filthy, if he had a future or not. He looked at me, cabby, as if I was someone important, as if I was worth something. In that moment, I saw his eyes get moist in the rearview mirror. I slowed the taxi down to give him time to compose himself and said, "Mr. Stallone, dogs don't lie about character. If that animal believed in you when nobody else did, it's because there was something worth it." He nodded, discreetly wiped the corner of his eye, and straightened his posture in the back seat. "You're right, cabby, but life didn't give a damn about character back then." Stallone took a deep breath and continued. "Life was about to rip even that away from me. I watched Stallone press that yellowed script against his chest, his fingers trembling slightly, as if holding those pages was the only thing keeping him steady while recounting the next part. He closed his eyes for a second, took a deep breath, and when he opened them again, there was a pain there that I had never seen in anyone. January 1975. $7 in my pocket. 3 days without eating anything but tap water, he said, his voice low but firm. It was 6 in the morning when the landlord banged on the door, demanding 3 months of back rent or immediate eviction that very day. Stallone looked around that empty, miserable apartment, searching for something, anything of value he could sell. He had no decent furniture, no watch, no jewelry. He had nothing that was worth 50 cents. Then my eyes landed on Butkus, he said, and his voice broke. The dog was lying in the corner, looking at him with those loyal eyes, having no idea what was going through his owner's head. In that moment, Stallone realized he only had one thing of value in that miserable life, the only being that loved him unconditionally. He described the walk to the flea market on 8th Avenue as if it had happened yesterday. Butkus walked beside him, happy, thinking they were going for a stroll. I stopped at the corner and grabbed a piece of old cardboard from the trash. I wrote with a black marker, "Purebred dog, $50. People passed by, looked, and Stallone felt every glance like a knife to the chest. Some shook their heads with pity, others laughed. One guy stopped and said, "If you're selling the dog, imagine how screwed you are," and kept walking. After 2 hours standing there in the cold, a short, fat man with a smelly cigar in his mouth stopped in front of him. He examined Butkus from head to toe as if he were buying a used car. He offered $40. Stallone asked for $50. The man huffed, threw the crumpled bills into his hand, and snatched the leash. I tied the leash into that bastard's hand, and Butkus looked at me confused, not understanding why I was letting him go with a stranger, Stallone said, the words coming out with difficulty. When the man turned the corner taking the dog, Stallone sat on the dirty sidewalk and cried like a baby. He had sold the only being in the entire world who truly loved him. I looked in the rearview mirror, gripped the steering wheel tight, and said, "Mr. Stallone, a man who sells his dog in a situation like that isn't selling an animal. He is selling the last piece of his own humanity to survive one more day." He nodded slowly, wiping his face with the back of his hand. "Exactly, cabbie. And you know the worst part? Those $50 lasted exactly 5 days. I paid part of the rent, bought bread, eggs, and bus fare for more useless auditions." Stallone paused for a long time, watching the Manhattan lights through the window. Then I was left with nothing again. No money, no dog, no dignity. And what happened after that was even worse. Stallone leaned forward in the seat, resting his arms on the back of my seat, and his voice got even lower, recounting the weeks that followed selling Butkus. The taxi was stopped at a red light in Times Square, neon lights reflecting on his face, and I could see the pain still fresh in those tired eyes. "Cabbie, after I sold that dog, something broke inside me. It wasn't just sadness. It was shame," he said, every word weighing like lead. He said he fell into a deep depression, the kind that pins you to the bed and won't let you get up even to eat. He couldn't go to acting auditions anymore. He spent entire days in that dark, cold apartment, lying on the freezing floor, staring at the cracked ceiling without blinking. I would lie there thinking, what kind of man sells his own dog? What kind of human being does that? Stallone asked, but he wasn't expecting an answer. The guilt was eating him alive. Sometimes he went 12, 14 hours without moving, without showering, without changing clothes. The apartment became a prison, and he was his own jailer. The bills kept arriving under the door like silent threats. The electricity was cut, the phone disconnected. The water was about to be cut too. Stallone said he ate once every 2 days, sometimes nothing but a hot dog that the Turkish vendor on the corner gave him for free out of pity. Mustafa, the owner of the stand, would see my walking corpse face and wouldn't even charge me anymore. He'd just shove the hot dog in my hand and signal for me to leave quickly. Ashamed of me, he had become the official neighborhood bum, that guy everyone knows and no one wants to look in the eye. Then came the phone call that almost finished off the last bit of hope he still harbored. Stallone called his father in Philadelphia from a public payphone using the last coins he had. My old man answered, and the first thing that came out of his mouth was, "Have you given up on this acting charade yet?" I stayed silent, unable to say anything. His father continued, relentless. "I warned you that you had no talent. I warned you that you'd starve to death. Come back to Philadelphia and get a real job before it's too late." And he hung up the phone in his son's face, without even saying goodbye, without asking how he was, if he had food, if he was alive. I turned slightly in my seat and looked straight at him. "Mr. Stallone, sometimes the person who should believe in us the most is the very first one to bury our hope in a coffin." He agreed, shaking his head slowly. "Yeah, cabbie." And that night, after that phone call, I sat on the cold floor of that miserable apartment and decided one thing. Either I died right there, or I found a way out. There was no middle ground. There was no more room for middle ground. Stallone took a deep breath, adjusted the script on his lap, and continued. And that was when, in that darkest moment, something completely unexpected happened that changed everything. I noticed Stallone straighten his posture in the back seat, and for the first time since he got in my taxi, there was a different energy in his voice, as if he were retelling the moment life threw him a rope while he was drowning. March 1975, a Tuesday night. I turned on that old tube television to distract myself from the hunger that was eating me up inside, he said. The channel was broadcasting a boxing match. Chuck Wepner, an unknown butcher from New Jersey, against Muhammad Ali, the greatest boxer who ever stepped in a ring. Everyone expected a massacre in the first round, but that is not what happened. Stallone described how he was glued to that screen, hypnotized, watching Wepner get beaten, fall, get up, get beaten again. 15 full rounds. The guy was bleeding, his face swollen, but he kept getting up. Ali even bled at some point. In the last round, Wepner was knocked down, but got up again before the count finished. He lost on points, sure, but no one in America forgot his name after that night. I saw that average guy, a regular worker, literally giving everything he had against a living god, and something inside me woke up from a coma, Stallone said, his eyes shining. He turned off the television, grabbed an old notebook that was thrown in the corner, and started writing at 10 at night. He wrote straight through, non-stop, until 4 in the afternoon the next day, 18 hours straight. Cold coffee, cigarette after cigarette, and the story pouring out of him as if it had already been written for years, just waiting to be put on paper. The story was about Rocky Balboa, a washed-up fighter from Philadelphia who gets an impossible shot at fighting for the world title, Stallone recounted. But Rocky wasn't fighting to beat the champion. He was fighting to prove to himself that he wasn't just another loser, that he wasn't garbage, that he was worth something. Every line of that script was autobiographical. The dirty apartment where Rocky lived, the loneliness, the rejections, the dream that everyone calls madness. I even put Butkus in the script, cabbie. Rocky had a dog and talked to him when he had no one else. Stallone explained that when he finished writing that first draft, he looked at the 120 pages scattered on the floor and knew he had something special there. It wasn't just a boxing script. It was the story of everyone who has ever been called a failure and refused to accept it. I looked in the rearview mirror and said, "You weren't writing about a fictional character. You were writing your own autobiography disguised as fiction." Stallone smiled for the first time for real since getting in the taxi. Exactly. Every word of that script was blood, was pain, was my life bleeding onto the paper. He made a dramatic pause, watching the busy streets of Manhattan out the window. But finishing the script was just the beginning of the real nightmare, because now I needed to convince someone in Hollywood to give a chance to an unknown with a thug face and a script about a loser. Stallone kept watching the bright lights of Manhattan out the window while retelling the following months. And I realized in the rearview mirror that this part of the story still hurt him like a poorly healed wound. Traffic was slow around 7th Avenue, which gave me time to hear every detail of that saga of humiliation. Cabbie, I spent the next 3 months banging on the door of every studio, every production company, every office in Hollywood that would accept walk-ins, he said. He carried that script under his arm as if it were the Bible. always wearing the same old patched suit, the same sneakers with holes that let his feet get wet when it rained. The waiting rooms were luxurious, with Italian leather sofas and movie magazines scattered on glass tables. Blonde secretaries in high heels and expensive dresses looked at him with barely disguised disgust when he walked in. They saw my cheap clothes, my bad haircut, my face of someone who hadn't eaten properly in weeks, and they wouldn't even let me sit in the good chairs, Stallone said, the bitterness still present in his voice. They told him to sit on a stool in the corner, far from the other candidates who seemed to belong to that world of glamour and money. The rejections were brutal and personal. A producer at Paramount read 10 pages of the script, threw it on the table with contempt, and said, "This is sentimental garbage. Nobody wants to pay admission to see a loser crying." Another executive at Fox didn't even bother to read it. "Boxing has been dead in cinema for 10 years. Next." A guy at Warner looked at Stallone's face and said before even opening the script, "You look like a thug, not a writer. Get out of here." Each no was like taking a straight punch to the stomach. Stallone went back to the miserable apartment in Hell's Kitchen every night, completely defeated. He had no money for the bus, so he walked the 4 miles back, dragging his feet along the dirty sidewalks of New York. I counted every rejection, Cabby. They were like punches in a boxing training session. By the 50th no, I didn't even feel the pain anymore. By the 100th no, I was completely numb inside, like a zombie walking through the city. But he kept going, day after day, because he had nothing left to lose. I nodded and said, "Hollywood wasn't rejecting your script. They were rejecting your face, your clothes, your Italian accent, everything except what really mattered." Stallone looked at me in the mirror and agreed. "You got it perfectly. They judged the cover, not the book." He did that characteristic dramatic pause of his and continued. "But on the 120th no, after 3 months of taking a beating, something finally changed. Someone said the word I hadn't heard in so long I didn't even remember what it sounded like. Yes." Stallone's voice got tense, almost angry, recounting the moment that should have been the biggest victory of his life, but turned into psychological torture. He sat up straighter, his shoulders went rigid, and I felt that this part of the story messed with something deep inside him even today. United Artists. Giant office on the 10th floor with a panoramic view of all of Los Angeles. He began to describe. An executive in a perfectly tailored Armani suit and a solid gold Rolex on his wrist took the script from Stallone's hands and read it right there in front of him, without saying a word. 2 hours of absolute silence while Stallone sweated cold in that leather chair. When the executive finished reading the last page, he closed the script slowly, looked into Stallone's eyes, and said simply, "Stallone, this is brilliant. Let's make this movie." In that moment, Stallone felt his heart explode with joy inside his chest. Finally, after 120 rejections, after 3 months of getting beaten down, someone saw what he saw in that story. Someone understood. The executive pulled open a drawer, took out a pre-prepared contract, and slid it across the mahogany table. $25,000 for the script. Sign here at the bottom and you walk out of here rich. It was more money than Stallone had seen in his entire life, adding up every job he had ever done. Stallone grabbed the pen with a hand, trembling with emotion, and started reading the contract, line by line. 4 years of guaranteed rent, food every day, dignity back, being able to rescue Butkus. But when he got to Clause 3, page 2, the words seemed to burn his eyes. "The lead role of Rocky Balboa shall be played by Ryan O'Neal or Burt Reynolds at the studio's discretion." He read it again and again. It couldn't be true. They wanted to buy his story but take him out of his own story. The executive lit an expensive Cuban cigar, blew the smoke out slowly, and spoke with the coldness of someone trading merchandise at a market. "You're a good writer, Stallone, but you're not an actor. Nobody knows you. You have facial paralysis, you slur your speech, and you don't even have a decent credit on your resume." He tapped his finger on the contract. "Sign this and get rich today, or refuse and keep sleeping in that hole in Hell's Kitchen. Your choice." The room went silent. Stallone looked at the contract, at the executive, back at the contract. $25,000, food, a roof, normal life back. I stopped at a red light around Madison Avenue and looked straight at him in the mirror. And you refused, didn't you? Because you understood that if you sold that role, it would be worse than selling Butkus. It would be selling your soul for real. Stallone nodded slowly, his eyes getting misty. I dropped the pen on the table, stood up from that chair and said, "No, I need to play this role. I am Rocky." And I walked out of that office. The doorman in gold livery closed the door behind him, and Stallone walked down the 10 flights of stairs because he couldn't breathe right in the elevator. And for the next few months, Cabby, I paid very dearly for that decision. Very dearly indeed. I watched Stallone squeeze his hands until his knuckles turned white, joints popping, recounting the phase he himself described as the darkest and most dangerous of his entire life. The taxi inched forward slowly along Lexington Avenue while he began to tell what came after that heroic but, in everyone's eyes, stupid refusal. I went back to New York with nothing. I had just refused $25,000, he said, his voice loaded with a mix of pride and regret. Everyone he knew, the few friends who still spoke to him, called him crazy, dumb, a financial suicide. "Stallone, are you nuts? Take the damn money and stop being an idiot," an acquaintance yelled at him in a cheap bar in Hell's Kitchen. But Sylvester knew, deep in his soul, that if another person played Rocky, he would never forgive himself for the rest of his life. It would be like watching someone else live his dream, use his words, tell his story. Worse than being broke was being broke knowing you sold your name, your identity, your essence for temporary security. "I preferred to die being myself than to live being a shadow of myself," he told me. The following months were literal hell on earth. The landlord lost patience and finally evicted him from that miserable apartment. Stallone spent 3 weeks sleeping at the Port Authority bus terminal, that dirty and dangerous place where bums, junkies, and runaways huddled together in the cold New York early mornings. I washed my face in the public restroom that smelled like urine and vomit, brushed my teeth there, slept on the hard plastic benches until security woke me up with a nightstick tapping on the sole of my sneaker. The early mornings were the worst. Biting cold, constant noise of buses arriving and leaving, fear of being robbed or stabbed while he slept. Then United Artists came back. They called a payphone where he used to hang out and made a new offer, $350,000 for the Rocky script, without him in the cast. $350,000, Cabby, Stallone repeated, letting the number echo in the taxi. I was sleeping on a bus station bench, eating garbage when I could, and they offered $350,000. He took a deep breath. And I said no again. The executive called personally the next day and said, "Stallone, you are the stupidest man I have ever met in my career. You're going to die poor, forgotten, and no one will remember you existed." I gripped the steering wheel tight and said, looking in the mirror, "There are things in this life that money doesn't buy back once you sell them. Dignity is one of them. You had already been forced to sell Butkus. You weren't going to sell your name too." Stallone looked out the window, watching the lights of the city that almost killed him pass by. "Exactly. But I came so close to breaking, Cabby. So close to accepting that money and giving up on everything." Heavy silence filled the taxi for a few seconds. Then, when I was literally 1 day away from accepting the offer and giving up on the dream, I met 2 men who changed absolutely everything. Stallone perked up for the first time for real, almost smiling, recounting the turning point that saved not only the movie, but his own life. He leaned forward again, but this time with positive energy, like someone finally about to tell the good part of the story after so much suffering. "Irwin Winkler and Robert Charthoff," he said the 2 names with genuine reverence, as if he were speaking of saints. They were independent producers who made small movies but with soul, people who understood that cinema wasn't just money, but also art and story. Stallone managed to get a meeting with them through a friend of a friend who owed a favor. He walked into that modest office in Burbank, wearing the last suit that was still clean, the yellowed script under his arm as always. Winkler and Charthoff didn't make him wait in a fancy room with a stuck-up secretary. They called him straight into the simple office, offered bad coffee, and asked him to leave the script. "No," Stallone said. "You're going to read it now, in front of me, or I'm leaving." The 2 producers looked at each other, surprised by the audacity, but agreed. They sat there and started reading Rocky out loud, alternating with each other page by page. Stallone described how he watched their reactions, laughing at the funny parts, getting tense during the fight scenes, eyes getting misty at the end when Rocky doesn't win, but achieves something greater than victory. When they finished reading the last line, Winkler took off his glasses, cleaned them with his shirt, and looked straight into Stallone's eyes. "This is special. This is very special. Let's make this movie." Then came the phrase that changed everything. "With you as Rocky Balboa." Stallone felt his knees go weak. He almost fell out of the chair. Finally, someone understood that he wasn't just the writer. He was Rocky. But there was a huge problem: budget. United Artists had offered millions to make Rocky with Hollywood stars. Winkler and Chartoff, being independent producers, had only $1 million in total to make the entire movie. $1 million for everything, cabby. Actors, locations, filming, equipment, food, everything, Stallone explained. So they made the offer. $20,000 for him to star, plus $15,000 for the rights to the script. $35,000 in total, 140 times less than the last offer from United Artists, but with his name in the lead role. I smiled, looking in the mirror, and spoke. "You accepted less money to have more dignity, more control, more soul." Stallone slapped his hand on his knee. "I accepted on the spot, cabby. I signed that contract without even reading the fine print." He paused, the smile fading a little. But the war was just beginning, because making a realistic boxing movie with just a $1 million total budget is practically impossible. And convincing a major studio to distribute a movie made by unknowns was literally impossible. But we were going to try anyway. Stallone's excitement grew visibly, recounting how they transformed all that misery into pure cinematic magic. He was gesturing with his hands now, reliving every moment of that insane production, and I could feel the energy changing inside the taxi. We filmed Rocky entirely in 28 days straight. There was no money for even one extra day, he said, eyes shining. The crew woke up at 4 in the morning, started filming when the sun came up, and only stopped after midnight. Many scenes had only one take because they couldn't waste film, which was super expensive. The famous scene running up the museum steps? One take, the entire final fight? We filmed it in a single day. It was all or nothing, cabby. Stallone described how they used real Philadelphia as the set, not fancy Hollywood studios. Real streets, with real people passing in the background. Real poor neighborhoods where people like Rocky actually lived. The iconic scene in the meat market, where Rocky trains by punching hanging carcasses, was filmed in a real slaughterhouse at 5 in the morning before the place opened. The owner, an old Italian guy named Giuseppe, let us use it for free because he read the script and said, "This is my story too." Cheap or free locations, practically unknown actors working for peanuts, handheld camera shaking in the action scenes. Everything improvised, everything real, everything raw. He told me about the most important scene in the entire movie, Rocky running up the 72 steps of the Philadelphia Museum of Art. There was no money to close down the museum, so they filmed very early with real tourists appearing in the background. Stallone ran up those steps 15 times that freezing November day. His legs burned, his lungs stung, sweat poured down even in the cold. On the 15th time on the last take, when I reached the top and raised my arms to the sky, "That wasn't acting anymore," Stallone said, his voice choking up. "It was me, Sylvester Stallone, beating all the producers who said no, beating my father who said I was a failure, beating poverty, beating everything." The final fight scene was another complete madness. They filmed in a gym rented for one day, with real extras from Philadelphia playing the audience. There was no rehearsed choreography. The punches were practically real. Me and Carl Weathers, who played Apollo Creed, beat each other for real for 12 hours straight, Stallone said. "We finished the day with cracked ribs, real cuts, real blood running down. There was a moment Carl looked at me and said, 'Man, we are crazy.' And I replied, 'It has to be this way. It has to be real. No stunt doubles, no movie magic, just two men fighting as if their lives depended on it.' I shook my head with admiration and said, 'Limitation forces creativity, Mr. Stallone. You guys made a masterpiece precisely because you didn't have a choice, didn't have money to do it the safe way.' He agreed, smiling wide. Exactly. If we had 10 million, we would have made a pretty movie, but with no soul. With 1 million in desperation, we made something people feel in their skin. Stallone adjusted the yellowed script on his lap, looking out the window. But when we finished filming and showed the first rough cut, nobody in Hollywood believed it was going to work. Everyone laughed at us, Cabby. Everyone. I noticed the tension returning to Stallone's voice, recounting the terrible months between finishing filming Rocky and finally managing to release it in theaters. He pressed his lips together, fingers drumming on the yellowed script, as if he still felt the anxiety of that time. United Artists agreed to distribute Rocky, but with an absolutely brutal and humiliating condition, he began. They wanted to release the movie straight to video, without showing in real theaters. Their argument was simple and cruel. Nobody was going to pay for a ticket to see a cheap boxing movie filmed in less than a month with an unknown actor named Stallone who had a thug face. Winkler and Chartoff refused on the spot. They demanded a theatrical release or there would be no deal at all. Stallone described the silent backstage war that happened over the following months. Studio executives tried to re-edit the movie without permission, cutting scenes they thought were too slow or too emotional. They wanted to completely remove the romantic scene between Rocky and Adrian. Too sentimental. Boxing has to be just fighting. They wanted to shorten the final fight. 15 minutes of fighting is too long. The audience will get bored. Every day was a battle to protect the original vision, to keep the soul of the movie intact against executives who only thought in ready-made commercial formulas. Then came the moment of truth. Test screenings in 3 small cities to test the reaction of the real audience. Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, and some lost town in Texas I don't even remember the name of, Stallone recounted. The first screening was in Philadelphia in an old theater with 200 people. Stallone stayed hidden in the back of the room, biting his nails until they bled, sweating cold even with the air conditioning on. If the audience hated it, it was all over. The studio would release it straight to video, and the movie would die without anyone seeing it. The lights went down. The screen lit up. The movie started with that now iconic music. Total silence in the audience. Stallone described every minute of that screening to me as if it had happened yesterday. In the first scenes, some laughs. Good sign. In the training scenes, concentrated silence. Very good. In the romantic scene, the studio wanted to cut. Sighs from the female audience. Perfect. Then came the scene on the steps. Rocky running through Philadelphia at dawn, music rising, that impossible run up to the museum. When Rocky reaches the top and raises his arms in triumph, something magical happened. The entire theater, all 200 people, stood up from their chairs and started clapping. During the movie, in the middle of the projection, standing ovation. I asked, already knowing the answer but wanting to hear it from him. And the rest of the audience in the other cities hated it, right? Stallone let out that smile of someone who knows they turned the game around. Cabby, the same thing happened at every screening. Pittsburgh, standing ovation. Texas, standing ovation. People were crying at the end. They would leave the theater and get back in line to watch it again. He made a dramatic pause, watching the New York lights out the window. In that moment, I knew we had won the war, but the best was yet to come, because what happened after the official release was something no one, absolutely no one, could predict. Stallone's energy literally exploded inside the taxi, recounting the climax of this completely absurd journey that seemed like a movie script. He slapped the seat with the palm of his hand, eyes shining, a broad smile on his face, as if he were reliving the best night of his life. March 1977, Cabby. Rocky had become a cultural phenomenon that nobody could explain, he began. The movie was released in November of '76, and in just 3 months, grossed $100 million, from an investment of just $1 million. The lines went around the block. People watched it 5, 6, 7 times. The movie touched something deep in the American soul that no one knew was dormant. Then came the news that would change everything. Rocky received not 1, not 2, but 10 Oscar nominations. Best Picture, Best Director, Best Actor for Sylvester Stallone, Best Actress, Best Original Screenplay, Best Editing, Best Sound, and so on. I was sitting in that miserable apartment in Hell's Kitchen when I got the call, Stallone said. The same apartment where he had starved, where he had cried after selling Butkus, where he had thought about giving up on everything. And now he was nominated for the biggest award in world cinema as an actor and screenwriter. The night of the ceremony was surreal. Stallone arrived at the Dorothy Chandler Pavilion wearing a rented tux because he didn't have money to buy one. He sat next to producers and executives who had rejected him a year earlier, who had called him a failure, who had said he would die poor and forgotten. They pretended they always believed in me, came to shake my hand, take pictures as if they were my childhood friends, Stallone said, sarcasm dripping from his voice. But he didn't care. He was there. Against all odds in the universe, he was sitting at that ceremony as a nominee. The most important moment arrived, the announcement for Best Picture. The presenter opened the gold envelope, took that purposeful, dramatic pause, and said, "Rocky." The theater exploded in applause, standing ovation. Stallone went up on stage together with Winkler and Chartoff, the producers who believed when no one else did. I looked at that ocean of people giving a standing ovation and thought, 2 years ago, I was sleeping on a bench at a bus station, selling my dog for a miserable $50, and now I'm holding the Oscar for Best Picture, he told me, his voice choking up. Rocky also won Best Director for John Avildsen, 2 Oscars, a movie made by unknowns in less than a month. I looked in the rearview mirror and said, "But you didn't win Best Actor, right?" Stallone nodded, and curiously there was no sadness in his voice. "No, I lost to Peter Finch for Network. And you know what? It didn't matter one bit, because I had proved what I needed to prove." He adjusted the yellowed script on his lap affectionately. "I didn't need to prove it to the Hollywood Academy. I needed to prove to myself that I was worth something, that my father was wrong, that all those producers were wrong." Stallone paused for a long time, looking out the window. "But there is one last part of this story that I haven't told you yet, Cabby. The most important part of all. I felt the car slowing down as we approached the Waldorf Astoria, and I realized Stallone was reaching the end of this saga that had left me completely hypnotized. He looked ahead, seeing the golden lights of the hotel, and asked the question that would change the tone of the entire conversation. "Cabby, do you know what the first thing I did was when I got the first fat check from Rocky?" I shook my head. "I went looking for the man who had bought Butkus 2 years earlier." Stallone said he spent 3 weeks tracking the guy down all over New York and New Jersey, asking in bars, flea markets, any place where someone might know him. Finally, he found the man in a dirty bar in New Jersey. The dog was there, older, gray muzzle, but alive. Butkus was lying in the corner while the owner played pool. I walked into that bar and the guy recognized me instantly. He had seen Rocky in the theater, knew who I was now, Stallone said, the anger still palpable in his voice decades later. He offered $500 for the dog. The man refused, smiling. He offered $1,000, refused again, $2,000, $5,000, $10,000. The man saw that Stallone was desperate and kept milking it. "I ended up paying $15,000, Stallone said, letting the number echo in the taxi. 300 times more than the original $50. But the price didn't matter, Cabby. I needed my dog back. I needed to rescue that part of my soul that I had sold in the darkest moment of my life. When Stallone clipped the leash on Butkus and started walking toward the bar door, the dog stopped, looked at him for 3 seconds without recognizing him, and then something clicked. Butkus jumped on him with so much force he almost knocked him to the floor, licking his face, crying that cry dogs make when they miss someone, as if the 2 years had never passed. It was the most expensive and cheapest moment of my life at the same time, Stallone said. The story didn't end there. Stallone described how he put Butkus in Rocky II, the dog playing Rocky Balboa's own dog. It was my way of publicly apologizing to him for selling him when he needed me most, Stallone explained. Butkus appears in several scenes of the second movie, always by Rocky's side, always loyal. He died in 1981 of old age. I have a framed photo of him on my desk to this day. I look at that photo every day and remember where I came from, Cabby. I remember that success means nothing if you lose your humanity along the way. The taxi stopped in front of the golden entrance of the Waldorf Astoria. The doorman in livery came to open the door. Stallone grabbed the box of Cuban cigars and that yellowed script he held during the entire ride. Before getting out, he turned to me and said, You know what the lesson of all this is, cabbie? Everyone will tell you that you aren't good enough. Your father, your bosses, the executives, society as a whole. But at the end of the day, the only opinion that truly matters is yours. If you don't believe in yourself when everyone has given up on you, nobody else ever will. I reached out and shook his hand firmly. Mr. Stallone, thank you for sharing that. You don't know it, but I needed to hear that story today. He smiled, paid for the ride with $100 bill, and said to keep the change. He got out of the car, waved one last time, and disappeared through the revolving doors of the hotel, leaving only the smell of the Cuban cigar in the air. I sat there, stopped for another 10 minutes after Sylvester Stallone disappeared through the golden revolving doors of the Waldorf Astoria, the taxi engine still running, hands clutching the steering wheel, eyes fixed on nothing, processing every word of that conversation that had just turned my life upside down. In 23 years driving a cab through the unforgiving streets of New York, I have heard literally thousands of stories. Some heartbreakingly sad, some inspiring that make you want to be better, and many completely forgettable ones that fade from memory before the passenger gets out of the car. But that story Stallone told me taught me something I didn't know I urgently needed to learn. The true price of human dignity is not measured in dollars, euros, or golden Oscars, but rather in how many times you look at the easy money, the safe exit, the opportunity to sell a piece of your soul and manage to say no even when you are starving and sleeping in a filthy bus station. That man sold his dog out of pure survival necessity, but refused to sell his dream, his name, and his identity for greed disguised as pragmatism. And that microscopic difference is exactly what eternally separates those who give up from those who win against all odds in the universe. Now I turn to you listening to or reading this story, and I ask you with all sincerity, how many times have you accepted less than you deserved just because it was easier, safer, more accepted by society? How many times have you sold microscopic pieces of yourself, of your identity, of your dreams, in exchange for temporary security that evaporated in weeks? If this story of Sylvester Stallone touched you in any way, if you felt that shiver when he refused $350,000 sleeping on a station bench, hit that like button right now. Share this video with that person you know who is about to give up on their dream, and subscribe to this channel because every week I bring real stories of real people who proved that the impossible is literally just a matter of perspective, insane persistence, and absolute refusal to sell your soul. Comment down below. What was the hardest thing you ever refused to sell in your life when everyone called you crazy? I read every single comment, I swear. And always remember, the taximeter of life never stops. The traffic sometimes gets impossible, but at the end of the day, you are the one who chooses the final destination. See you on the next ride.